All right, Dr. Perry, here we are live on all kinds of platforms. And I can tell you that I do this podcast every single week. And I think the excitement around this one is a little higher than some of my previous, and I know why. And it's because of you, your work, and this remarkable, new, amazing book that looks like it's been through all kinds of things, because I've carried this book for the last week and getting it out every chance I have, reading it. So how are you? Welcome back. I don't know if you know, but you were on episode 7 and this is episode 47. So it's poignant and perfectly timed.
Well, first of all, Matthew, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I very much appreciate the work that you've been doing since we last spoke. You know, you have reached lots of people, help them understand the importance of these topics, and it's a welcome element to this whole initiative, this whole effort, kind of a movement that we're involved in.
And it is a movement, and you know, because you've been able to travel and have these experiences, it's an international movement. This isn't a movement that's strictly in the United States. It's not a movement that's strictly in North America. We're talking about a national and international movement around science. I mean, that's the powerful thing. This isn't just feelings and ideas. This is research-based information. So how did this book come about? Because the way that it was outlined and the way it was conversational was so amazing and easy to read and absorb. How did it come about?
Well, thank you for saying that. It's interesting because Oprah and I have known each other for 30 years, and we've had a lot of different settings and situations where we've worked and had together and had conversations about different aspects of trauma and the impact of trauma. And this book actually was the idea of Bob Miller, who was he's the publisher of Flatiron, which is an imprint of Macmillan Press. And he and Oprah worked together on a lot of other publishing initiatives. And so Oprah had been a special correspondent for 60 Minutes and did a feature on trauma-informed care and was highlighting her community in Milwaukee, part of where she grew up. And when she talked to the people who were doing that work, she had no idea that they were involved with our Neurosequential Network. And so when she heard that, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, you want to be on this 60 Minutes thing?" I said, "All right." So we did an interview. It's a funny thing, that's 12 minutes of high profile airtime, but it had a big impact. And her publisher saw that and wrote her an email and said, "Hey, do you think Bruce would be willing to write a book for our imprint?" And so she asked me, and I said, I've already written a book about this, and writing a book is a real pain in the butt. It takes a long time. And I said, "You know what, though? If you write a book with me, I'll do it." And so she said, I don't know how to write a book. And I said, "Well, you've written books," but she said, "I don't know anything about this." I said, "Well, but we've talked about this a million times, and why don't we just record some conversations?" And so I went to her ranch in Hawaii for 4 days, and we sat down and had conversations, and they were recorded. And then working with somebody on her team, Jenna Utley Kostelnik, who's a woman, really wonderful woman. She sort of parsed down that transcript, and then I took that and rewrote a lot of stuff, and Oprah added a couple stories, I added a couple stories, and we had our book. So
I get the whole book thing. I talked to a publisher about a year ago, and I'm like, "Yeah, I will." No, I can't. I don't have. This is my media right here, having conversations with people. But the conversation process is amazing. I want to jump into some of the book because there's so much, and honestly, we only have an hour. I could probably talk to you for 6 hours about this book because there's so much in it. But in the very beginning of the book, you wrote that love is relational superglue.
Yeah.
And that that little phrase, I feel like, should be a bumper sticker, a t-shirt. It should be tattooed on my arm, because it really is the foundation of this work, is it not?
Well, I agree completely. And I think, I've done a lot of research about a lot of different things in how the stress response works, and how certain patterns of stress can lead to resilience, others can lead to vulnerability. And, the first part of my career, and I think we talked about this a little bit the last time, the first part of my career is focused on all the bad things. How do you get, what happens when all these horrible things happen? And of course, we ended up finding, like everybody else who studies this, in it, attention problems, relational problems, physical health issues, all kinds of challenges to the human being. But at the same time, as I was studying this, I was seeing people who lived through these terrible things and were pretty healthy. They might have had some vulnerabilities, but they were kind people. They were creative. They were productive. And I was like, wow, this is pretty amazing. And over time, we started to look at the factors that were involved in what helps somebody live through basically life. I mean, life has got all kinds of unpredictabilities. And even if you have a good life, people you love die, or, jobs that you like, you get fired from, or, things happen. And so we began to see that this incredible power of being connected, and that more than that, if there was at least one person in your life who basically loved you, that was like this lifeline that allowed you to basically get through things and then be in a position to start to thrive at some point when other people sort of would jump in. And again, a lot of your work is in education. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard about how a teacher or a coach, one person, was for a child this loving presence that kept somebody going enough that they would start to take advantage of other people that were out there. And it was just a powerful learning. And I think that when you look into it in more detail, you find that across the board, whether you're looking at it from an anthropological perspective or you're looking at it from a neurobiological perspective, that both the neurophysiology and the psychology of love is what makes our species survive and thrive.
And I think the use of your anthropological stories, especially that of New Zealand and the indigenous people at the end. I was an anthropology minor. I know that's just so strange out of education, but it's something that really resonated with me. And when you got into the complexities of culture and things, but when you get into what is trauma, right? And you use this fire analogy and everybody's perspective of experiencing a fire, I think that was so powerful, because people assume that certain events are traumatic when they might not necessarily be, depending on the perspective. And I want to share a very quick story with you. I served as a foster parent for a couple years, and we were going through all kinds of supports for the child, one of the children. And when we sat down, we started going through some of the therapeutic processes, and he was going to tackle one of his worst experiences. And of course, his experiences were unbelievable. But he chose the most traumatic thing that he felt, the most impactful thing, was when his dog died. Mm-hmm. And it was so powerful to me sitting in the room with him, because I was there going through the process with him. And what we perceived as being traumatic to him was not at all. Of course, he didn't necessarily know, but that was what he felt was the most hurtful and harmful thing he had ever experienced.
Right. Right. And again, speak back to the whole issue of love. It may very well have been that in that time of his life, that this dog was the one source of unconditional love and affection, and the loss of that was just catastrophic. So
what when you identify trauma, right? Because we're going to get a conversation here in a little bit, and I told you earlier about trauma informed. When you explain trauma, how do you explain it to people? And if you've got listeners here that are just starting this journey or having these conversations with their principals or their superintendents or their schools, how do you guide people to have that conversation around what is trauma?
Well, there's sort of two perspectives I take. One is the perspective of the neurobiologist, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think one of the most helpful formulations around defining trauma came from a consensus panel working with SAMHSA that sort of wrestled with this for a long time and ultimately came up with just this recognition that when you're thinking about what is trauma, it's important to think about three things, the three E's. One is sort of the event. So like you can look at, we're working now with people in Santa Clara who are dealing with the shooting in their transit site. And so anybody can go, wow, the shooting in a transit site, that's traumatic. And the reality is that event was traumatic for some people. Certainly the people that were there had an experience, there's the shooting, then there's their experience physiologically, internally, while they were in the midst. And for many of them, the experience was terror. So their stress response system gets activated in this extreme way. And then the third component is the third E, if you will, are the effects. So right now, many of those folks who had these, were in the event, had the experience, and then now are having the effects of difficulty sleeping, fears about going back to work, wondering whether or not seeing somebody that looks suspicious, what are they carrying? Is that an umbrella? Is that a gun? Those are the effects of that event. And so there are times when you can have a traumatic event, but the internal experience is not that extreme. And I gave the example of a fire, a firefighter in the midst of, running into a burning building. If you're experienced, they're going to have a brief activation of their stress response, but they're going to do what they're trained to do. And they won't have any effects from that. In fact, that having another successful fire that they put out leads to resilience for them. It's a moderate, somewhat controllable experience, and it was controllable because of the way they're trained, and so, but another person who may have been there, who didn't have the training, had never been in a fire before, was scared to death, they're going to have a completely different experience, and they may end up having long-term effects, whereas the firefighter won't. And I think that this is something that, again, this is one of the reasons it's been very difficult to study trauma. When you're a researcher, do you just sort of document the event, or how do we track the actual experience of the individual? Should they self-report on it? How do we measure dissociation or activation? And then how do we track the effects? So like the ACE study looks at what are plausibly effects, increased risk for heart disease, increased risk for mental health problems. But again, there are shortcomings in all of those approaches. And this is, again, why trauma is so very hard to put your head around. That's why I always retreat to the biology. Mm-hmm. I always go, all right, a traumatic event is something that a trauma is something that is going to change the reactivity and the functioning of your stress response capabilities and change it in a way that will be functionally compromising. And so that could be something as simple as being, and we wrote about this in the book, being somebody who's in the out group in a school. So just going to school for that person can have a traumatic impact on them because they're continually getting the nonverbal cues that you're not one of us. You don't sit with us. You're not the right color. You're not the right religion. You're not the right whatever. And that it repeatedly can make somebody experience trauma just by going to school. And then later on, if they're talking about it, other people would go, where's the trauma? Everybody goes to school. Everybody, everybody gets teased a little bit in school. What are you talking about? And again, that's kind of a misunderstanding of the experience that someone can have.
Well, and I think even in your book, you talk about the finding that the history of relational health, your connectedness to family and community and culture, is actually more predictive of your mental health outcomes than the history of adversity.
Right.
And I think that speaks to what you just said, right? And we are the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. So the last time I spoke to you, you said something so powerful that I've been spreading around almost every episode, is those little interactions every single day that we can have between ourselves and students could really serve as a major buffer to adversity.
Exactly.
And that goes to that piece, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that connectedness or not is a much, I think it's more powerful in shaping our physiology and our mental and physical health. But it's also a more actionable thing, right? When somebody comes into your classroom and they've come from a background where there have been all kinds of bad things happen, as a teacher, you can't do that much about that. You can't change that. But what you can do is you can be present and you can listen and you can, pull this kid into an after-school activity and you can encourage him to go out for band and, you can help build connection, whereas you can't erase adversity.
And somebody just posted up here, and this is a quote from Karen Treisman. Dr. Karen Treisman out of the UK. I don't know if you know her, but she says you don't need to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And we talked about that last time, because one of the big pieces that I hear in education all the time, well, I'm not a therapist, right? Yeah. And what you said in the podcast last time, you don't have to be. No. Like, nobody's asking you to be a therapist. Simply asking to have positive interactions and purposeful understanding of adversity, and have those positive interactions so you, right, can be part of that relational health for kids.
Exactly. And I've said this a number of times, that the majority of therapeutic experiences don't take place in therapy. They take place in the classroom, after school, with a coach, with a friend, with a parent. Those moments that are healing and therapeutic are rarely provided by the therapist. Because the majority of kids that need healing, number one, don't get access to a mental health provider. And number two, even when they do, they only see that mental health provider maybe once a week.
Absolutely.
And so it's, as you point out, Matthew, it's these day in and day out relational moments that make a difference.
And I think what people have to understand too is we're programmed in education to get immediate results, right? We're supposed to do something, do an intervention, academic, even, Lord forbid, the behavioral idea of interventions, but we're supposed to get immediate results. And I think a big piece of what you say in here is that it takes time sometimes, and it sometimes takes extensive amounts of time. And I think that's where, as education, we have to do better. We can't just do attempt, attack, abandon these processes when it comes to helping the psychological and relational safety of kids in our classrooms. Yeah. So what are some, besides those interactions, when you've worked with schools and you've got the Neurosequential Model of Education, which, by the way, we received a grant that I'll be getting the whole school trained. So that's super cool. I just found out it's going to go through the Department of Justice. I was supposed to tell you that, by the way. Nonetheless, what do you tell schools about this, like understanding regulation and co-regulation and all of these big words? How do you explain it to schools?
Well, it's interesting. When we start talking about the core concepts about stress, what we call state-dependent functioning, general organization of the brain, it's remarkable how quickly educators cue in on that. Because I'm simply giving language most of the time to things that they've already seen, that they've already observed. I mean, most teachers who are decent observers have figured out all kinds of really important things. They may not know the underlying sort of neurobiology, but they figured out that if a kid's hungry, thirsty, cold, frustrated, angry, they're not going to learn. So the key is to help teach educators and everybody who's involved with kids and with other people, are there ways to proactively and intentionally create a developmentally optimal environment? And I say developmentally because that it kind of includes academic, but also social and emotional and motor development. That all of these domains and parts of the brain need opportunities for healthy developmental challenge and growth. And that's, again, that happens in school.
And one of the pieces in your book, and I wrote it down, and it was in a developmentally uninformed, trauma unaware setting will expect many children to act typical. And I see that play out all of the time.
Yeah.
And I've seen it in my school, to be quite honest, where we get students that are different in developmental stages for whatever reason, relationship based or just their life experiences, but yet there's an expectation when they walk into a classroom that they meet the developmental expectation of of a grade they are on. How do you feel that's an impact, and what needs to change around that?
Well, part of that's because we've put educators in an unfair position, I think.
Absolutely.
We ask one teacher to sort of meet the fundamental needs of a group of children who are clustered together based on their age, not based on their social skills or their cognitive skills or their motor skills or any of these other areas. They're clustered together based on age. And so the teacher's kind of forced to do curricular activities that are targeting the mean, which means the kids that have already mastered the content are going to be a little bit bored. And then they'll ultimately, that'll be an issue you have to deal with. And then there'll be some kids that'll be behind, so far behind that your curricular expectations leave them lost. And so that'll also lead to other kinds of tune out or act out behaviors, which draw bandwidth from the teacher. And so we just put teachers in this incredibly unfair situation. And so part of what we've been trying to do with the NME is one approach is if we can give a teacher this shortcut to figure out for each child, what are their developmental sort of capabilities? Where is this kid developmentally in terms of social skills, cognitive, motor? And we figured out a way to kind of approximate this pretty quickly so that a teacher can, when the teacher is aware of a need to teach something, you can cluster kids over here and give them a different example and a different body of work to kind of address the same issue compared to the kids over here who really have already sort of mastered some of this content. So one group kind of gets remedial content, one group gets enrichment content, and that's the kind of thing that makes it so much easier for the educator. But on top of that, one of the things that's really important is that we've spent a lot of time trying to help educational environments appreciate what we refer to as sort of relational contagion. That if the teacher is not cared for, if the teacher isn't regulated, there's just no way that they can regulate dysregulated kids or effectively teach. And so, I just got off the phone with a big group in Kansas, and yesterday I had an opportunity to talk to Secretary Cardona. Mm-hmm. One of the big things that I talked about in both situations was we need to take care of our educators. Mm-hmm. They need to be respected. They need to be regulated. They need regulatory breaks. They need professional development. They need adequate supervision. They need opportunities for reflection and refreshment. And because if they're centered, they're going to do a great job. But if they're not, if we keep pushing them off balance and giving them unrealistic demands, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. It's just, and again, that's what we do. We just put more pressure on educators. We say, test this, and don't teach that way, teach this way. Don't teach that content, teach this content. I think the life of an educator is miserable. And I
think you're right. I think you're right. Yeah.
And this year's been horrible for educators.
Right.
Because not only have we been asking them to do all these things, we've been changing the rules every 3 months or 2 months or 2
Absolutely.
weeks. And
Absolutely.
so the unpredictability and uncontrollability that educators have been living with this last year, on top of their own, they've been having to take care of their own kids and their own families. And so I don't think there's any other group except maybe frontline healthcare folks that have been more impacted by the pandemic. And I think right now what we need to do is take a deep breath, recognize that we have to help our educators get regulated, let them get back to the state, the internal state where they can do their thing. Because our educators are smart, they're caring, they know what to do when they have the space to do it. But we got to give them the time and the space.
It's true. And, Dr. Perry, at my school where I'm the administrator, we have a tap in and tap out system, and it's just for that, right? Because it's unrealistic to think that adults day in and day out are going to stay regulated in every situation. And I share openly my situation where I became extremely dysregulated. I had a child in the library who about threw a wooden sphere at me, and it triggered me, and I went to a place that was not safe for myself, and the librarian tapped me and said, "You need to go to your office right now." And that mutual accountability of support of like, I see that you're dysregulated, so I'm going to go ahead and call and say, "Hey, you need to go somewhere else." Yeah. And I'm going to step in. But we have a support system where teachers just go to our group me and say, "I need to tap out." And that provides the support. If the adult wants an adult to go with them, they'll go with them. If not, the adult simply steps into the room and manages and watches the children while another adult walks out with the adult. And the adult can say, "I'm good, I just need a minute." Because it's true. And there's that study in 2016 that tested the cortisol levels of saliva and the self-reporting of teachers for stress levels. And there was a direct correlation to high stress levels and increased cortisol levels in students. Yeah. It is one of the biggest driving factors in our schools right now are overworked, overstressed educators. Yeah. And we're trying to do it on a small level in one little school, but systematically. I'm glad that you got to talk to the Secretary of Education to express that, because it needs to be said. Yeah,
and I've told a lot of people about what you guys have put in place in your school, because it's a great example of, it wasn't an inexpensive thing to do. It's just it's a light touch, creative innovation that recognizes the reality of how the stress response works and the reality of human interactions, that incorporated can lead to all kinds of positive changes. And one of the great things about it is that you're modeling for kids how to manage dysregulation. I mean, you can't. It's interesting. I talk all the time about the difference between a teacher who is dominant versus a teacher who's domineering. Mm-hmm. And a lot of teachers, for example, when we talk to them about flexible administration of consequences, or basically giving kids a little bit of leeway or flexibility, there's this fear that the other kids are going to see that they got away with it, and you're not holding them accountable, and so they think it's like dogs and cats are going to come down. And it's like, yes. And so I just keep telling them, listen, these kids know that Billy is going to blow.
That's exactly right.
They know better than you. They're just probably taking steps in the back row about when it's going to happen. So when you show dominance, flexibility is the behavior of a dominant person. So when you show flexibility, these kids are reassured. They're more regulated. They're not going to start asking for that special thing that you gave Billy. They know that if you didn't do that to Billy, all hell would break loose. Mm-hmm. And so, again, this is one of those things where if we support our educators, if we educate them, we give them opportunities to be creative in their classroom, all kinds of good things can happen.
Well, and I think, too, that enhancing the skill sets and the knowledge of educators is important. And I speak from my own experience of my first year principal, where we were physically containing kids almost weekly. I suspended 35 kids for 52 days because I didn't know what else to do. And that's no excuse, because that's on me as a leader. But that second year, it all changed, because I realized what we were doing to kids wasn't what we should be doing with and for kids. And again, it was that we've got to show, no, that is what it's proven not to work. We know that systematically it's proven not to work. And in your book, I loved that at the last the last chapter, I think it was, and even deep into the book, you got into bias and you got into the impact of some of these practices that are utilized that are absolutely impacting marginalized communities and kids. And I think that somebody earlier, and I'm going to try to look for it really quick, was talking about the impact of exception students that are in exceptional education and the impact of trauma that plays on them. And I think even in schools, we traumatize kids based off of some of these practices. So can you get into why you chose to go there? Because we have to. It's some of the foundations of the work we're trying to accomplish.
About the sort of the implicit bias and
yes, absolutely.
So interesting because Oprah and I had these conversations 3 years ago, way before the kind of the Black Lives movement sort of happened and the equity things happened in the last couple of years. And we had that conversation because we were both very much aware of how these issues played out at her school and in other environments that we both worked. And one of the things that, again, part of what I've always known, and it started early on when I was at the University of Chicago, first training, was that the process of doing therapeutic work and also the process of teaching involves forming some kind of relationship. But I knew that relationships are always fraught with the tendency to use what we call theory of mind. Mm-hmm. And so theory of mind is basically taking your own worldview and your own set of experiences and applying them to another person. And so for example, if you see somebody who looks sad, your theory of mind, if you were somebody who likes being comforted and somebody wants, what happened to you, can I help you? Let me give you a hug. That person who thinks that way, had that kinds of comforting when they were feeling upset, would try to go over and comfort somebody with the internal expectation, well, that's what people want when they're sad. But if you're a child who's come through an early developmental experience where people have been unpredictable and abandoned you, and physical proximity was associated with pain as much as it was associated with comfort, you don't want comforting you that way. And so the difference between your worldview and that other person's worldview in application leads to conflict. Mm-hmm. So you come over to the child to give them a hug to reassure them, and they say, "Get away from me, I hate you, you're ruining my life." Mm-hmm. And the loving foster parent, adoptive parent, or teacher's like, "I'm just coming over to be nice to you and try to help you. What's wrong with you?" Right. That you would not reject that nice stuff that I'm giving. And again, it's this misunderstanding of how people work. And I think we do the same thing we all carry around our own internal catalog, and we all have a working version of how the world works. And that working version has been influenced by our developmental experiences. Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand that, you're going to make all kinds of misjudgments and miscommunications and missteps with people who didn't grow up like you did. Mm-hmm. Which is really frequently the case in educational environments. I think of my grandson and my children's elementary schools. Every year they would have a little bit of a sort of a cultural awareness day, and they would talk about how many different languages and different backgrounds that the kids in this one classroom, 25 kids, came from. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't unusual to have like 12 different languages, mm-hmm. 13 or 14 different countries where these kids had come from. And then you think about the teacher who's got their worldview. Mm-hmm. And no matter how well-intended you are, you're going to step on toes. And you're going to make missteps. And things you think are kind of funny when you jokingly say something might actually hurt somebody's feelings. Mm-hmm. And this can... And we do this with gender identity, with race, with your religious beliefs and all kinds of stuff. And so and we wrote about this a little bit, part of what I think is important in that process is sort of and you pointed this out, Matthew, is that if we help our educators understand that it's inevitable that we're going to have these little ruptures, but that we need to focus on the repair part.
Absolutely.
That, and sometimes the rupture and repair leads to a stronger bond than if you never have an opportunity to kind of have a misunderstanding and repair it. But the key is to have the repair. Because a lot of times with little kids, when you're on the top of a power differential and you make a little rupture with somebody, they don't give you the opportunity to repair because you're not even aware that you offended them. So, and I'll give you an example from my life. When I was probably in kindergarten, I think it was, there was a woman, Mrs. Lee, who I adored her until I found out that she told my mom that I was either going to be the president or go to prison.
Yeah.
and she was probably just joking, right?
Right.
But in my little mind, I thought that she thought I was a bad person. A smart person, but a bad person.
Yeah.
And to this day, I remember it. Think about that. I kept thinking that that's the way teachers think about me. They think that I'm a bad kid. That they acknowledge I'm smart, but they don't quite like me. And I carried that all the way through school. And the fact that I didn't go back, I never had a chance to let her know that hurt me.
Wow.
Because I was a little kid. You don't go up to a teacher and say, wow, you really hurt my feelings. And so that rupture was never repaired. And we do that all the time.
All the time.
Think about the people you love the most, right? How often are you saying, honey, I didn't mean that? This is what
way too much, way too often.
I know, like, I was just joking. Or like, it's like, oh.
Yeah, it's true though. But we've got to get in that stance. And when you talk about that rupture and repair, I think we have to see ourselves as educators of all pieces. So when we make mistakes, having those conversations of, I'm really sorry. I wasn't listening to what you said and you were trying to explain yourself. As a principal, I've done it to adults, and as a principal, I've done it to students. Like, I'm sorry, I misunderstood what happened and I thought you were the one and that isn't the case, or whatever it is. And that is a game changer, Dr. Perry. It's a game changer for cultures of schools when adults are not afraid to apologize and fix what they've made mistakes with kids. And I think that goes to that restorative process that we have to continue to build within schools. Because as you say, right, and there was a lot of examples in here that simply punishing for mistakes is not going to really change much behavior.
No. And there's a lot of people in this space that have been really articulate about, and probably much more articulate than I can be, but you just can't punish somebody into learning a skill. No matter how much you punish somebody, or even worse, you can't exclude somebody with the expectation that that's going to help them learn anything new. And again, one of the biggest challenges we have in all of education, I think, in sort of the social emotional space, trauma-informed space, whatever you want to call it, is helping people better understand contingency-based, neuroscience. What do contingency-based approaches actually work with, and what don't they work with? And what we know is that they do not work with anybody who's dysregulated, and they do not build new skills. And yet, if you go to most schools, contingency-based approaches are really probably the dominant way that they manage children that are struggling with behavior issues. And now, the really refreshing thing is that when you see a school shift in their worldview about this, you literally see the evaporation of expulsions, the evaporation of restraints.
Yeah.
And you see things like increased student attendance.
Absolutely.
You see decreased teacher sick days. The whole climate of the school is a place where people want to go. And it makes a big shift. And so again, I like the paradigm shift, that you think about that, because this is what we're trying to get.
It is. You're exactly right.
We have these wonderful people that are in these environments, great kids, some struggling kids, but even those are great kids. Just a shift in paradigm can really lead to significant changes in outcomes.
Well, and Dr. Tracy Benson was on last week, I think, or maybe it's the week before, and he wrote the book Unconscious Bias in Schools. And he had a phrase in his book that applies to so much, and it is, I never question the intent of an educator, but I always ask about the outcome. I know you didn't intend for this to be the outcome, but let me talk about the outcome. And I think we have to start having more conversations around, I don't think educators are ill-intended, right? They're not having an ill intent on doing these things, but we know now, based off of all of the research, that the outcome of transactional interactions versus relational interactions are completely different. It's about the relational interaction. It's not about a transactional. It's not about, you did a good job, so I'm going to give you something.
Right.
It's about, you did a good job, and I just want to affirm you as a fellow human being. And I think you're right. When that shift happens in a school, the paradigm begins to really adjust. And I know that from my own experience. Of it gives kids and teachers more empowerment to connect to each other.
Yeah.
And it's powerful.
It is very powerful. There was a really smart teacher that I worked with once who had a really, really big challenge with an adolescent who was aggressive and acted out a lot and really incredibly disruptive to class. And we had a couple of conversations, and basically this person was always trying to take over the class. And her response initially was to be more controlling and give him less and less and less, sort of as a consequence. And I said, well, why don't you give him control of the class?
Yeah.
Like, what? I said, well, why don't you ask him to teach the next lesson? And she was like, well, that'll never work. I said, give him a chance. And so she didn't do that, but initially, but what she started with was, when she would go down to the principal's office to get something, she would put him in charge of the class, like the most, and the first time she did it, she was, of course, incredibly anxious, but he did a great job. And then she slowly gave him more and more responsibility, and then ultimately asked him to co-teach a certain lesson. And it literally, the whole climate in the classroom changed. Mm-hmm. And she sort of rotated, other people could co-teach. But once she sort of gave control and tried, instead of being domineering, she was dominant. See, only a dominant person gives up control, mm-hmm. right? A domineering person garners power, mm-hmm. right? Someone who's insecure garners power, as we've mm-hmm. seen in our recent presidential politics. But mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A dominant person doesn't worry about that. And it really shifted the classroom.
And that's part of our actual full mission at our school here in Nashville, is that we have to identify the genius in every kid. And empowerment is a powerful piece in schools, relinquishing control to kids. Yeah. We have a leadership day every day that's ran, planned, and implemented by kids. And I'm not going to lie, I don't have to control situations, but I was very anxious the first year. And we had a little boy who kind of went off the rails with the DJ mic, which I have to admit, I found very entertaining, and everyone else did too. And he taught me a lesson, like perfectly imperfect is great. When kids are shining and they're doing what they're comfortable and their genius has been identified, you just let them shine. And I think so much we try to control kids in school settings because we get caught in the job and forget about the work. And I think that's really important to go, well, why not just relinquish control to them? Why not let them do a little bit of empowerment there? Because it is a game changer. Yeah. So I have a question, and this is from a friend and amazing author as well, Joe Brummer. He wants to know about, you wrote about this actually in the book. What about like post-traumatic growth and strength? And because he's like, he said, I spoke to several people and that have had experiences, and I know he has had experiences himself, and how they come out with stronger skills or new learning, or what are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, loss, pain, trauma, these, it's profound depression. There are all kinds of things that in the moment are exquisitely painful, but they don't always last. And the people who are able to get through traumatic experiences or painful experiences, usually with the help of others, very often arrive at a place in their lives where they're much more capable of being empathic to other people in distress. They have certain insights that you can't get if you just haven't had that kind of experience. And people have written about post-traumatic growth, and Oprah and I wrote about post-traumatic wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of even beyond post-traumatic growth is this reflective state where your traumatic experiences have helped you understand what is really important in life. And that's part of wisdom, is just recognizing that worrying about the test doesn't really matter, or having the perfect shoes to wear to the event, that's not really the most important thing. And so if you don't have the money to get the perfect shoes, the event can still be good. Or recognizing that the person sitting next to you on the bus, who may not have any formal education, may have more understanding of core philosophical principles than anybody who taught you philosophy in college. Being wise really requires passing through pain. And a lot of times, not just passing through, but continuing to carry pain, but carrying it in a way that it's not spilling over on everybody else. Mm-hmm. Which is a challenge at times, I mean, it's the person who can transform their pain to power is really a special person. And I think everybody out there listening can think of individuals in their life or people they've read, people they've met, people they have known, who've been able to transform pain to power. And I think that's a really important thing. And again, I don't want to make too much of a commentary on our culture, but I think all too often parents are trying to overprotect their children from distress. Yeah. And I think fear of distress, fear of discomfort leads to more problems than being willing to say, listen, I'm going to be right here, but you got to get in the mud. Mm-hmm. We're going to walk, we're taking this hike, mm-hmm. and you're going to get tired. I'm going to be right next to you. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to pull you up this. You're going to climb up there. Mm-hmm. I'll be there if you fall, but you're going to do the climbing. So if you have somebody help you, get through all of that stuff, you come out of that experience completely differently than if you didn't do it. And so I think it's important, both as teachers, as parents, as coaches, we don't want kids to live in their comfort zone. We want them to continue to grow. But we want to challenge them in a way that's developmentally appropriate, mm-hmm. and ideally relationally yoked, right? Mm-hmm. There's a scaffolding person there who's going to be able to help you in the process. And when that happens, great things can happen. The sad thing is when you've got a kid who doesn't have anybody out there, yep. and they're trying to learn how to take their first step, and nobody's got their arms out, smiling at them. Right. Do it. Yep. And in this day and age, teachers more than anybody else are becoming the people that are saying you can do it, mm-hmm. and asking kids to leave their comfort zone and stretch themselves.
I connected to a lot there. And the first thing I want to kind of talk about that I connected to is when you talk about people who've gone through something, it kind of changes the way you see things. And on April 10th, I lost my mom after a long battle of health problems. And I immediately connected to people that are in my school who lost a parent, that I wish I would have known what my experience felt like then. And I actually apologized to several of them, saying, I'm so sorry I was not present like I should have been when that happened to you, because I simply didn't know. And when people held space during that time, I could feel the grief, but it made it manageable. And then secondly, when you talk, and this is by no means adversity, but my son has been in karate since he was 5. He's 10. He had a black belt test about 2 weeks ago, and he failed it. He's been working 5 years. And the parent in me was like, oh, it hurts. Like, it hurts my chest. He's upset. And then it was like, no. This is an opportunity. And I kept talking through him, and I was like, we've got to understand this, that this is just something that you've got to come over. We got to practice a little more. We got to keep working on it. And because he was devastated. And as a parent, I just wanted to comfort him and make it's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. But it was an opportunity for growth. And I think a lot of times we miss opportunities like that because we want to comfort our kids when really there's opportunity there to give them, they expand themselves in their growth.
Exactly. And kind of referring back to something we talked about earlier, one of the reasons that we as parents want to comfort and undo what happened is because we feel their pain, right? We want to feel less pain. And I think that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to sit in pain with another person, whether it's grief or whether it's disappointment or whether it's sadness. And so we've learned all these techniques to undo things, right? We undo how hard it is for you by saying, oh, that's okay. You'll do it next time, pat him on the back and kind of walk away. Honestly, we tend to use the term resilience that way. I've been involved in a number of situations where horrible things happen, and the people involved, not directly, but the people involved sort of tangentially, will in the beginning be really supportive, but after a while, it's like the overwhelming grief of somebody who loses a child, for example, is like, wow, this is so intense. So they start to fade away, and they don't show up as much. And to make themselves feel better, they start talking about resilience. When in fact, that person's still crushed. They're not going to be over this in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. This is a lifelong loss. They lost a child. But we're talking about how resilient people are. Isn't it great? Because it makes us feel better. And so again, there's no doubt that you could build resilience. I think sport builds resilience. Excuse me. I think drama in school builds resilience. I think the challenges in karate, that's going to build resilience for him. But resilience isn't something that doesn't come through sitting in a class. It doesn't come because you have a t-shirt that says, we're resilient. It comes from adversity. Resilience is built from having stress. It's just that there's elements of controllability, there are elements of predictability, and there's elements of moderation. And so for your son, there's a controllable element to this, right? There's a predictable element because he knows when the next test is going to be. And there's a moderate element because he's going to be stressed, but he's going to have you there to help buffer. It won't get too prolonged or too overwhelming. And so this is going to be a wonderful resilience building opportunity for your son.
And I have so many questions, and we only have like 7 minutes. I told you it'd go by fast. But we have one listener that says, where do schools start if they want to be? And I do want to get to the question I told you before we got on. But where do schools start if they want to become trauma informed? This is $1 million question that I get all the time as well.
Well, it kind of depends upon what level of query. I mean, if this is a principal versus a teacher versus somebody else. I mean, one of the ways that we've seen schools do this, and this is really how our NME project started, is Steve Grainer, who's the head of our Neurosequential Model in education. When he was a teacher, they started their journey by simply having a book study. and they took the boy who was raised as a dog, and they had a completely voluntary book study. And little by little in their conversations with people they knew about, this book, but also bringing in kids they all knew. This reminds me of Tommy, and I wonder if we should have done this. And so that was the beginning of the journey for them. We've actually talked, we've already had a couple of schools start to use the book, What Happened to You, as their school-based book study.
Absolutely.
So I think that's one way. I think there's lots of people out there that have created pretty nice content to introduce, some of these core concepts. Our group has done some. I know some other groups have done some. I think, the key is, and Matthew can probably has been talking about this for the last 40 sessions, it's not one of these one-off things that you can do. It's really like a change in philosophy. It takes a conceptual pivot, which takes a lot of relationship building, a lot of team building, a lot of capacity building. And there are a lot of different pathways, but they all kind of end up converging on the same core elements.
So let's talk about the word trauma-informed, because in your book, you get into the use of these words. And you and I had a conversation, and LaToya Nelson was a guest on this, and she started using healing-centered, and that just resonated with me. What is the complexities of using words like trauma-informed, and what do you see this work moving towards when it comes to the terminology in which we use about the work itself?
Yeah, and we kind of started the conversation around even defining trauma, right? I mean, there may be people listening who know this story, but one of the reasons there's not a lot of trauma-related diagnostic stuff in the DSM is that the people that wanted a developmental trauma diagnosis couldn't agree what the definition of trauma should be for that label. And so when they got in front of the committee, there were other problems, and there are other things that they were confronted about. But the reality was our own field has had a hard time defining just the word trauma. So when people started using trauma-informed and then trauma-aware and then trauma-infused, and they applied it to countries and cities, and Scotland's declaring itself a trauma-informed country, which is like, I would like to see what that means actually.
Right.
The issue, and we talked about this, is just sort of that it leads to a lot of fuzz and miscommunication. So if there's a lot of different people that are using the same word but have a different understanding about what that means, then it leads to kind of fog. Whereas the use of healing or healing-centered or health, it's still a broad term, but I think it's easier to converge on. I think more people recognize that there's it's a bigger umbrella. And I think we tend to use language in a really precise way because we do research about things. And so before I use the term trauma-informed, I'll ask, which version are you talking about? The SAMHSA version of of 2000 whatever, or the SAMHSA CDC version? Or are you using the National Center for Behavioral Health version? Or are you using the Saint A version for, because there's like 20 different versions of trauma-informed. And that's where the problem is, Matthew, I think, is that there are people, here's the second problem, and this is probably not going to make a lot of people happy, but whenever money comes into a field, there are people that will hang out a shingle and self-declare that they're experts. It just happens. Now, if there's no money in this field, we wouldn't be having this issue. But now there's money in education, mental health, child welfare. Everybody wants to be the trauma-informed school. And so there's people that are saying, hey, I'll make you trauma-informed, and we'll do a 3-hour professional development for your staff. And you can check the box and say, we're trauma-informed. We did the program from so-and-so. And that's part of the problem, is that it's not a one-off thing. It is it's like tending a garden. You got to weed it, and you got to plant new things, and you got to water it, and there'll be fruits And every year you got to start over again. And that's what it's like. It's like having a garden.
Well, and I say all the time, there is no finish line. Like, you don't arrive. There is no trauma-informed, the most trauma-informed educator of the trauma-informed movement. There is no finish line. And let's be honest, the research has changed over the last 10 years, and it's continuing to advance and get to know more of what we need to do different. It's not a stagnant field where you've got it figured out and then we just stop and there we are. And I think that's important. And even the conversation that we had in episode 7, which was well over a year and a half ago, I think, which you talked about those I call them micro interactions. I don't know what they're actually called, but those minute interactions have such an impact. That has weighed so much on me as an educator, that knowing that those good mornings, those, hey, is everything okay this morning? That's why we have a team of 7 people that welcome every kid in the morning, because we want to see, as soon as they walk in, somebody's calling them by name, somebody's telling them good morning, somebody's handing them a mask because we have to wear them at school. There's constantly a team. And I think that is so powerful. But that was just one little piece that I took back and ran. And I think that's the power of the work. We have to be talking about what does it look like, and that there is no finish line. You do not arrive in a trauma-informed school. It is a cultural shift. It's a mindset. It's an operating system. It is not a check-the-box type of process. Right. At the end of the day here, we are at 1 hour, and I want to give you time to tell educators whatever you want to tell them right now. We're still kind of in the midst of a global pandemic. It Yep. is summer for a lot of us, but some people are still in school. What do you want all educators to know?
Well, I want educators to understand that they're important. There are a lot of things that happen over the course of a school year where you feel like you're unimportant, like you don't feel like you're seen. And I just want you to appreciate that children, and very often the families, do see you. They know how important you are. They may not always tell you, but you really are important in the lives of these kids. And I'd also just want you to know that because you are so important in these kids' lives and in the sort of the health and welfare of our society, it's really important that you take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Because there's not a whole lot of people rushing up to take care of you. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's not like there's an Oscars for the best teacher. Well, maybe there is, the Apple Award or whatever, but it's relative to the importance of what you do for our society. There's not a proportional focus on supporting and celebrating what you do. So you take care of each other, be patient with each other. And when wherever the pressure comes from, whether it's parents or your school board or administrators that want you to sort of catch up, just smile, nod, and just forget about it. The most important thing to help everybody involved in education get to a good place in 3 years, if we want to be at the best place we can be in 3 years, we need for the next 6 months to rest, slow down, and regulate, and actually learn from the last year. There's some really useful learnings, particularly about how you learn cognitive things. It can occur in smaller doses. We can do more regulating things, and we can yoke regulation with cognition. And if you do that, you're going to be much more effective. So.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope that teachers, because this whole idea of self-care is a hot topic. And I want people to look beyond just getting your nails done and having a beer or a glass of wine on Saturday. This is really about understanding your own self and your emotional regulation and how stress impacts you. And I've learned that the hard way. After my first couple of years, I didn't think I was going to make it through this field until I learned how important it was to take care of myself. And sometimes that simply means disconnecting from all of it when you need that space. So I want to remind everybody, we have the Trauma Informed Educators Network conference coming up. It is not in cacting. I think it's hilarious that I just noticed I misspelled that word at the bottom, because that's been on there for like 4 episodes. It's not in cacting equity. It's actually enacting equity. And for those of you who know me personally, know this is just how I operate. But that is July 19th through the 21st. We have 2 keynote speakers. We have 48 sessions and only 300 people by design, because we want to make it small so we can all connect and get to know each other as well as we can in a virtual space. So we hope you will join that. Dr. Perry, thank you so much. I figured in about 40 more episodes, I'll have you back on your next book. And we'll just have another conversation. But I know I'll be reaching out to your team because of that grant, and I cannot wait to get my team completely trained in that first step of the neurosequential model, because it is a game changer. Those 3 little R's, regulate, relate, reason, have changed my trajectory as an educator and has helped me understand what I need to do to support a kid that is dysregulated. So thank you for all your work. Thank you for all of you who came in to listen. And as always, please, please, please be safe. And as Dr. Perry said, just go rest. Go chill for a while.
Exactly. Thanks, Matthew.
All right. Thank you all very much. And we'll see you next week.